I'm just going to share my screen and get going with a slideshow. Let me just move away this bar so that I don't have all of these screens. All right, so how do we use the sensory matrix to transform lives through real world case studies? And it is really around helping neurodivergent individuals thrive in life and work through a sensory informed insight. So I'm really excited to share this with you. This used to be my old life. I used to work with neurodiversity, but with children many, many, many years ago before I actually moved into the adult space and positioning sensory intelligence as an adult as well as an adolescent framework. So it's wonderful to see that there's so much interest and shifts into also looking at this for the adolescent and the adult world. So just a bit of introduction and housekeeping. So from a chat box point of view, please pop in the chat box for us. Where are you from? Where are you based? It's always nice and interesting to see where all the people are from, and lovely to see that. So, Tanya, one can help you. I probably need to, oh, I can see PE. Let me just open the chat box. Uh, Vienna, Canada, awesome. PE, great stuff. Awesome. California, Cape Town, Paul Petersburg, Southern California, Durbanville, Jordan, Joburg, Canada, Scotland, Las Vegas, Cornwall. Great, great, great stuff. It's awesome to see where you're all from. And then maybe what's your background or what's your profession? Are you a therapist? Are you a coach? Are you a designer? Are you a mother? Are you just someone who's interested in what we wanted to offer here? So please share with us in the chat box where you are from. That's awesome to hear that. And Tanya, you can also look at that and let's keep track on what people are doing in their lives. Lots of OTs, development operations manager. Um, Great stuff, great stuff. Lovely to see that. I'm just checking all of that. Thank you for sharing that. Human design professional. Awesome. Thank you so much. You're so welcome. Okay,
Lots of
great. That's
OTs.
usually the type of people. Tanya?
Lots of OTs.
Lots of OTs, lots of OTs. Thank you. And then I just wanted to know, is anyone on the call very unfamiliar with our work, have never heard anything about our work before? That's the other thing, because what I've done, because there was such a big interest, I've brought some of our concepts back that I don't always share at these webinars, but I just thought for context purposes. So I'm going to assume that some of you are not really, I'm pretty new to it, Maria. Okay, great, thank you. So I was anticipating for that, so just making sure that I've read the group really well. So I am going to spend some slides just going over some of the background. Then the other thing that we're going to do, Tanya, you can probably do that in the middle, not necessarily now. Because people don't always put your name on your screen, so afterwards it's a bit of a nightmare for us to collate names on screens and registration list through Zoom, just so that we make sure that you can get your CPD points for it. There's one free CPD points, obviously, for your attendance. So that is the purpose why we just run that poll halfway to make sure that we don't miss that. So please, if you can fill that in. If CPD is not important for you, then you can just disregard that and don't bother about that. Just please bear in mind, we don't have a webinar format. We've got a meeting format. So please keep yourself muted. But I do think Tanya has also muted you. However, please use the chat box and feel free to drop any comments or any questions right throughout the session. We do have some time for Q&A. So towards the end, hopefully we will get time to get into that. Then we can certainly address your questions. There will be a recording that will be shared afterwards. So you can always listen to a recording afterwards. And I also know that we only have space for 100 people on the call. So there were lots more people interested. So we will also share the recording with everyone afterwards. Okay, great. Thank you. So let's get into it. Three things that I want to do with you tonight. First of all, a framework. What is sensory intelligence all about? I'm just going to give you a high-level brief interview. A lot of you on the call, I know I'm very familiar. You've been exposed to the work that we've done before, but also for the case of those of you who haven't been, I'm just going to do a slightly bit of a deeper dive. But very quickly, what is sensory intelligence all about, and why are we positioning this from a neurodiversity point of view? And then we have some real world case studies. I love case studies. Those of you who know me, I'm a little bit besotted with it. We have to get better at writing evidence-based case studies. And really, these webinars was put together to try and shift all of us that work in this field to be more evidence-based. What are we doing? What are we changing? And what is the results that we are getting with our clients? So big thanks already to Helen and Tasneem. They are two sensory intelligence practitioners who's familiar with our work and who are sharing some of their case studies. I also have a brief case study that I will also share with you, and then right at the end, some Q&A before we just close off the session. Right, so this might not be new to you, but just for context, let's just go through this a little bit. 1 in 5 people may be neurodivergent, and you will see I've shared some of these links with you. Where did I get this data from? You're welcome to check them out afterwards. I don't want to dig too deep into it because I think most of you who's interested in this field would probably be very familiar with these statistics. 85% unemployment or underemployment in autistic adults. That's the sad part because I think they've got so much to offer for the workplace. And then 17% of the workforce may be neurodivergent. I think that's really important stats that we need to look at. And then this is still interesting for me what most models miss. We often focus on mindset, behavior, performance, and strategy, but underneath all human functioning is sensory processing. It is the invisible system that shape how people think, how they feel, how they respond, how they connect, how they perform, and how they cope. So it's often so overlooked and misunderstood. And this has been my quest for so long. It helps us to make the invisible visible. And if we just go back to some of the research, and those of you also know me, I love research. I'm quite a bit of a data geek. We can really get wrapped up into this, but the bottom line is sensory processing differences are so central to neurodiversity and their daily functioning. And we know up to 90% of autistic individuals experience sensory difficulties. That is very clear. This has been very old. These statistics, and I've seen, have been around for a long time. It keeps on being confirmed. And I think in some of the stats, you can even say 95% of people on the ADHD spectrum struggle with sensory issues. Well, there's a 2025 meta-analysis study. I think it's Panagiotis. She or he, I don't know if it's he or she, has done a lot of research on ADHD. 5,000 people confirm significant sensory sensitivity and avoidance. So we are clear in these two, and I'm not going to go into the whole neurodiversity as a spectrum. I'm going to leave that. That's not part what we're going to cover tonight. So there is a bit of a focus here on autism and ADHD. I think those are the more well-known, highly more prevalent neurodiversity symptoms or conditions, but there are obviously way more than that. And then obviously research confirms the impact on workplace engagement, cognitive performance, and quality of life across the lifespan. That we're very, very familiar with. Sensory processing influence hugely how people work and live throughout the day, and particularly in our neurodiversity population. This work is so critical and important for them. In my world, it benefits everyone, but particularly people on the neurodiversity spectrum. So let's just look at a little bit of sensory intelligence framing. We've got 7 senses who actually shape our regulation and our performance on a consistent level. And I've given you an image here. We've got visual and auditory, touch, smell, and taste, movement. Movement is 2 senses. That's why it's 7. There are only 6 blocks, but movement consists of vestibular and proprioception. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is how the human brain perceives the environment on a day-to-day basis. It gets fed through the spinal cord into the human brain. So it has a bottom-up input, a bottom-up influence stream before it filters through the rest of the human brain and the nervous system. And it impacts the way that we work, the way that we learn, and obviously the way that we live as well. And then a little bit on this, because here I think it becomes really, really important. If we look at the regulation equation, there's a lot of discussion around nervous system regulation. So I'm like, yay, this is definitely being talked about. It's a lot more prevalent in social media, a lot of discussions around regulation. But if we want to look at it from a sensory point of view, the brain, and if we go back to information, enters the brain at the bottom. So the brain first sends in the primitive brain regions, then it moves to the limbic system, then the brain feel, and then only does it reach and move up into the executive part of the brain for thinking. That is hierarchical, how the nervous system is positioned. Then it comes back again. Obviously, it's a two-way stream, but information enters from the bottom upwards. So sensory input works around first nervous system processing. How do we get a regulation state, and how does that influence our behavior and our performance? So if we change the input, in other words, if we change what is happening through the sensory systems at the base level, at the fundamental lower level at the brain, we can shift our states. We can change cognition or thinking. That is fundamentally, using the sensory neuroscience and how it actually influences thinking and behavior within the human brain. So nervous system processing is the sense part. It happens at the bottom. We also call about bottom up regulation. How do we use the senses to regulate the body and the brain? How do we get a regulated state for performance and behavior and thinking and reasoning at the end of the day? So I think those three levels are just important for us to just rehash again, because so much of what we do is based on this hierarchy. So then I just want to talk to you a little bit about the sensory matrix. I started my first version of the sensory matrix was built in 2005, following my PhD research, what I was using Winnie Dunn and Katana Bright's adult sensory profile, and I was just frustrated with some of the correlations that was happening within that assessment, and it complicated my PhD. And the matrix for me was also I needed to understand what are each of the sensory systems like of a client in order to help them. Is it visual, or is it auditory, or is it touch? So it was really designed in order to help people understanding what is going in the sensory system. So we map out your unique sensory identity across your 7 systems, because there's no right or wrong. This is just part of your sensory wiring. And then we can pinpoint your regulation risk. In other words, if you've got low thresholds for auditory, we know that's a risk for distraction, that's a regulation risk that could create overload. Versus if you have high threshold for movement, we can utilize that for regulation and as a way to offset potentially the impact of the auditory system. So, and then we build targeted strategies around your sensory thresholds. And I think most people spend years managing symptoms without understanding the source. Every single time that I do a sensory matrix with people, and you'll hear it from our practitioners as well, people will say, wow, it's spot on. Now I understand this about myself, or now I can understand why that particular situation doesn't work for me. So what we kind of intuitively think about becomes very clear when people go through the sensory matrix. And I really believe if we know our senses, we can absolutely change our lives. I have done that for myself, and we also take people on this learning journey so that they can do the same for them. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Helen to actually start with the first case study on neurodiversity. So, Helen, it's all over to you, and I'll manage the tools here for Helen. So, Helen, you can go ahead. Okay. Just unmute. Oh, Helen can't unmute, Tanya. I think can you unmute Helen? Great. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Tanya. Awesome.
Right. Yeah, sorry. Hi guys, sorry about that. I was like, I didn't know how to express myself for a moment.
Yeah, don't worry. What we did, Tanya did, we've unmuted you all, because I've been in calls before and then suddenly you unmute and then there's background noise. So thank you. Go for it, Helen.
Okay, so this was a client I saw about a year ago. I called her TM, and she was a 23-year-old lady diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder and Tourette's syndrome. As you'll see there, that the referral came from her mother, who is a healthcare professional, and found me through various connections and sent her daughter along to me. She was at the time living with her mom at home, but she had the year previous, so that would have been 2024, she had been living at university in residence, completing her honors degree in environmental management. So in many respects, really like high functioning. But now she had this plan that she wanted to do a master's. And she was back at home without the structure that she had had while she was studying, and struggling to find her feet again. So she really identified quite a few problems. She was really struggling with task initiation and focus, struggling to figure out where to start with all the things she needed to get done. She could be quite distractible, but also she did have that hyperfixation on certain tasks and certain repetitive patterns of behavior, as we know is common. She really wanted to apply for masters, but was really struggling to get through the process of application because it included needing to reach out to potential supervisors and present potential research to them and get permission to take them on board as her supervisor in her application. And she was also at the time struggling to sort of conceptualize how she could have some income. You know, she's been away from home, she studied, now she's come back, and she has no sort of independence financially. And also she was struggling a little bit to sort of conceptualize once she studied how that future career could look. So she would sort of go backwards and forwards between I need to study but I can't figure out what my future looks like, and so on. She was finding herself getting really, really anxious and feeling quite scattered, and then she would just sort of hermit herself the more anxious she got. In fact, on the first few sessions she came to me, I had to keep the lights off in my office. She sat in the corner on a big couch with a hoodie up and wrapped a blanket over her. In fact, the first session, I think the blanket went over her face entirely, and then she slowly emerged as we worked. And she also had great difficulty with social interaction, which was in her day-to-day life, but also affected her application for masters, as I mentioned. Okay. So in terms of goals, this really emerged over a number of sessions, a lot of discussion. I had to work quite hard on sort of building trust and getting her to sort of accept me as a partner in crime, as such, a partner in the therapeutic process. And so we had a few things that she wanted to work on. She really wanted to work on her health and fitness. She wanted to get back into healthy eating, and she wanted to get back into exercise. She obviously, as I said, wanted to apply for her master's research program, but that required her picking a topic and developing it, which was a huge challenge. She also needed to do some sort of preparation around figuring out her independence when it came to moving back to university and what that would look like. And particularly because a master's tends, especially a research master's, tends to be a lot less structured than an honors. And yeah, we were grappling with some of that. And she also wanted to find some work or income generation while she was waiting for her studies. And of course, she wanted to feel less anxious because she felt like that was having a big impact on her functioning. So as I said, at the beginning, there was a lot of investment in forming that trust therapeutic relationship with her that took a while. And we completed the sensory matrix quite early on. As I've described, she had some clear sensory flags going off from the beginning. We also worked quite a lot just looking at her activity patterns, looking at her task engagement, and what that looked like over a number of weeks and how that could be adjusted. And then we looked at the home environment. Unfortunately, she did not allow me, her trust did not extend to letting me do a home visit. So it had to be done through description, but I did also have collateral from her mom with her permission. So I had a bit of an idea of what her environment was like. Okay, so these were her sensory matrix results, and as you can see, they are across the board in the low threshold category. Not the lowest score I've seen by the way, but still relatively low. And and this sort of dovetails quite a lot for those of you who've worked with the sensory matrix. People with low thresholds will tend to prefer a certain amount of predictability, prefer a certain amount of control, patterns, organization, all of that sort of stuff, which is what she had sort of lost in the transition from where she was studying into moving back home into an old space, but a space that hadn't been hers for a while. And so, yeah, that was really something that gave us a lot of a launch pad for me to speak to her about what we could do to help her feel more regulated and feel more calm as a baseline so that she could get to all the functioning. I'm speaking fast because there are many things. So we did a lot of education and discussion around sensory functioning. This was really helpful for her because she liked concrete things, and having this very clear, here are the numbers, here are the scores, this is what it tells us, was a really helpful point. And then when she got dysregulated, we could go back to that. And in therapy sessions, sometimes we would we would adjust the environment for her with the lights down and the space and the warmth and things like that. But also sometimes we would have sessions where we would go for a walk as the first 15 minutes of the session to try and get a little bit of movement in and get that regulation, and then go back and sit and look at her research plans. And so we used the sensory processing quite a lot. And a lot of advice went into, and a lot of the sort of micro goals along the way were around adapting her home environment, particularly her study space. So this included things like the curtains that she put up, how she put her files together, the colors she used, how she cleared the space, all of that. And then because she also wanted to work on exercise, we could incorporate a lot of proprioception. So she started doing hiking. So there's an open area of land, which is quite hilly and foresty, and she would go and walk there every day. And this became a really helpful start to her day. But as I say, we use it for sessions as well. And then within her diet, she did a lot of research around healthy eating. And so she started doing meal preparation. And so she would have repeated meals, which again comes into the sensory, the low sensory threshold, where she's not getting this extreme stimulation of now I'm having curry and now I'm having whatever. So she had started incorporating that into her daily routine, and it also just created a bit of predictability for her around her days. Okay, we can go to the next. And then again, we did a lot of activity scheduling for regulation, as well as to support her motivation and focus. So how can we put the things that you need to focus on after the things that regulate you so that you can function better? So we worked a lot on those, and again, the collaborative goals. And then we worked on her research proposals, and did a lot of consideration on pros and cons and different options and plausibility. So, and then at the end, which was lovely, I haven't seen her in a few months now, but she was a lot calmer. Her workspace, she had now set up her workspace, which meant she was getting more functional hours into the day, sort of more not functional, productive hours into the day. She was doing her daily walks and doing really well with that, and the meal preparation was going well. And she'd also taken on some of the home tasks. So she'd taken on gardening, particularly as her area at home. She'd also developed her research protocol for masters and managed to find a supervisor. And she started volunteering at a local school for special needs with particularly neurodivergent children. Um, and the idea was that she could both be an example to them that you could have neurodivergence and get an advanced degree, and that she could provide support for them. And then they allowed her to then essentially advertise by word of mouth as a potential tutor for people who needed more intense work. So that became her uh, income generation plan. But with going to the school, one of the things we worked very much from a sensory perspective of examining, okay, what does a school give you in terms of sensory load, and how do we need to incorporate that into your week so that, and how many hours a day can you manage and things like that. So the sensory matrix really followed through as a thread all the way through. Sorry, I'm done.
Thank you, Helen. That was really awesome. Yeah, guys, and I did tell them you brilliant. You went into, I think, 16 minutes, no, before 16 minutes. So thank you so much for sharing. We really do appreciate that. And I love hearing the stories of the clients that you've been working with, because that really what makes it real and come to life. So thank you so much for sharing that, Helen, and keep up all that good work. Tasneem, over to you. Tasneem is going to be a second case study. You can just unmute Tasneem, Tanya.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can go for it.
Okay, great. So, for those of you who know me, I'm a chatterbox. So I've asked for a 5 minute indication so that I don't talk too much. I am presenting a case for a client who I actually only recently was seeing. We're calling him Mr. RJ. He's a 39-year-old male, and interestingly enough, when I first met him and did the intake assessment, he explained that he only recently found out that when he was 15, he was diagnosed with ADHD, but his parents didn't believe in that kind of thing, so they never told him. And as a result, he never received any kind of support or intervention for ADHD, and he's always kind of managed, until now. Works in the mining industry as a technical supervisor. So it is a very technical job, and he has to, go out onto the field quite a lot and deal with a lot of people. But he lives on a farm alone, and his true love is actually horticulture and farming and gardening and that kind of thing. And his absolute dream is to be a homesteader and to actually make money off his farm. Um, but what had happened is that he had quite a few things happen in his personal life, as well as he had a physical injury of his ankle. And the combination of all those things really threw him off in terms of his daily habits and routines. And how he actually started seeing me is that his boss noticed that he was very distracted, he was very overwhelmed, he couldn't focus in meetings, and he wasn't really coping with his work when normally he's like a star worker. And so his boss recommended he see an OT, and that's how we began seeing each other. You can go to the next slide. So what's interesting is, before I just go through his presenting difficulties, is as I started working with him, I obviously didn't tell him this because that's not that was I felt that wasn't my place and it wouldn't really make a difference. But I felt that he actually was more autistic than ADHD and possibly was misdiagnosed as a child, because although he had lots of attention regulation issues, majority of his presentation was autistic. He had a lot of social communication quirks and things that affected him in his workspace, etc. And what his presenting difficulties at the time when he saw me was more around, like, he was very like structured in the way that he ran his life. He relied a lot on structure and routines, and that's why when that got thrown out the window, he really struggled to get back onto the back into like a rhythm, so to speak. And the fact that he was struggling at work was very much from a sensory point of view. So what his presenting difficulties were A lot of people, oh, this was another thing that had happened in his workplace was that there were a bunch of people that in senior positions that suddenly resigned. So a lot of extra workloads were on him, and it required him to do a lot of context switching. And when I first saw, whenever I saw him online, he was always in an office that was kind of a bit dark. So, just to his presenting difficulties, he was really struggling with prioritizing tasks because of switching between different things, and everything felt urgent. That he had lost his sort of routine in his day-to-day life. He wasn't messaging his parents as much, which really bothered him. And he wasn't getting to do his homesteading and his gardening and things that he really enjoyed. He was also really bothered with like his home feeling disorganized and not getting to like the dishes. He doesn't like things like lying around, and he was bothered by not being able to do that because he just had lacked motivation. He struggled with task initiation. And also he felt like he was going towards burnout. So essentially when he saw me, he was almost like on the brink of burnout. We can go on to the next slide. So, what he really wanted to achieve is he really wanted to re-maintain his habits and routines, and he wanted to make time for the homesteading and gardening. He wanted to improve his work-life balance. He wanted to get back into a self-care and home maintenance habit routine. He wanted to improve his family relationships by, making time to contact his parents. He wanted to learn strategies to manage all the multiple work interruptions and all the context switching and all the external extra demands that were suddenly on his time. And he wanted to improve his productivity because he was finding he was extremely distracted and struggling to focus on tasks, especially for more complex, deep focus tasks. And he was also experiencing low mood and motivation. And that also concerned him because there is a history of depression in his family. So, of course, we did the sensory matrix. We also did executive functioning assessment, and I also did an occupational profile where we looked at how does he actually spend his time. I looked at like what does his environment look like, etc. So as you can see from his profile, he has very extreme thresholds. Like he's a deep root for most of for almost for all his senses basically. The only one that he's got a high threshold for is movement, and multisensory is fluctuating. So some of the things that we discussed around his work in particular is that he sits in an open plan office, but since a lot of the senior members had left, he would go and find one of their offices that are empty and sit in it. So through the sensory profile, we actually discuss some strategies he can use. So for example, he puts the lights down, he likes dim, he likes darkness, like sort of darkness, putting his screens in dark mode. He likes, and then having like earphones in. I recommended to him to get for meetings when he has when he's an online meeting, he needs to still hear. So you obviously can't use noise canceling headphones. And he started using those like what do they call those flare audio things, so that it reduces the frequency so he could still listen to the meeting but dampening out some of the external sounds around him. But when you didn't have to listen to other people, he obviously had to he used noise cancelling headphones. He already had them because when they go on the mines, they have those protective ear equipment. And so he just kind of used that. And then it was also things like having, because he loves plants, and although he's visually a low threshold, something that is pleasing that fits with what he enjoys. So he had a plant on his desk so that when he was feeling overwhelmed, he would look at the plant instead of understanding, like, instead of looking at everything else around him. Also making sure that his desk space and his workspace was neat and organized and not too scattered. But sometimes he also worked from home. So it was also looking at his work environment about where he worked. And obviously, because he had lost his daily routine of seeing to the cleaning of the house, that's why the organization of the work was also bothering him and affecting his productivity in work, because he would be working on his computer, but he would like constantly be aware of all the, like, what he called the clutter in his environment. So we had to look at how we had to actually look at strategies on how he could find the time to to clear up that clutter. So although the sensory matrix informed his sensory profile and gave him tools and strategies from a sensory point of view to reduce distraction and to regulate himself, etc., from an executive functioning point of view, it had to go hand in hand because I had to then help him with strategies for managing his capacity and managing, and also like tips and tricks for getting him to initiate tasks. So the approach that I take, I think you can go to the next slide. The approach that I took was to, first of all, identify baseline sensory strategies that he can use in everyday activities, but then also to what I call a capacity informed approach, where essentially capacity is your energy and time, because the time factor was really important in terms of deadlines, etc. So the way I explained it to him is that your sensory profile affects your energy state, because when you become overwhelmed, it reduces your capacity for how much focus you can have. Whereas if you use sensory things that can fill your cup, so to speak, restorative tasks, as I call them, that can refill your cup like charging a battery, basically. So then it can increase your capacity. So a lot of the work we did was also understanding what his capacity, his energy patterns are throughout the day based on the sensory context that he's in and the environments he's in, and what changes he can preemptively make or have as regulation tools in his environment, and also recognizing when his energy state is low. And then the capacity informed approach from an executive functioning point of view is identifying what tasks he has on his plate that are deep focus versus quick win tasks, and how can he make sure that he makes time for restorative tasks that are linked to his sensory profile, to make sure that he balances out so that he's not just doing high capacity tasks in windows of time that actually doesn't match how long the task actually takes. So we looked at the triggers that he needed to be aware of, and how he can use sensory strategies to restore focus. We looked at also, very importantly, emotion awareness plus a sensory response. So when he notices that he's feeling from an emotional point of view overwhelmed or depleted, how can he use sensory things to actually regulate him so that he can feel better? I see I have 5 minutes and I am almost done. So a big part was that restorative task for him is being outside in nature, having his hands in the soil, planting his plants, doing all of those things, going for a run, going for a walk, being out in nature really restores him. So it was super important that we did prioritize him making time to do those tasks in between his work. So at the end of it, through all the strategies that we implemented, and it was very funny, like cute, because constantly in our sessions he would be like, "Oh, it makes so much sense. Wow, it makes so much sense." And every time I see him the next session, then I say, "How's it going?" And he's like, "Very well, hey, very well." And actually, if I tell you, I only saw him 5 times. I only saw him 5 times, and at the end, in the fifth session, we agreed that he doesn't need to continue seeing me weekly. He can just make an appointment when he needs a top up or he's not sure of anything. But at the end of it, he managed to complete a project he's been procrastinating so long. He was actually 1 week ahead of schedule. He decluttered everything. He plowed his garden. He even told me like some stuff was starting to sprout. He recognized when he was feeling overwhelmed, so he would go for a walk, he'd go for a run, would go tend to his garden. And he really made great strides in that short amount of time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tasneem. So that's all done. I love what you've done with that, with Mr. RJ. And as I say, always great to hear the stories of the clients that you've been working with. And I think your client that said that education and helping them to understand who they are from a sensory point of view is always so empowering. So that is really, a trend that we always hear from clients. So I'm going to just share the next case study very briefly. Tanya, yes, you can pop the poll up now.
Anna Marie, can I also just interrupt you before you continue about
Yeah, go for it. Go for
a
it.
question about what multisensory domain refers to?
Okay. Okay, so there was a question. What is multisensory? I know if you see that both Helen and Tasneem shared their client sensory matrix score, all of the questions that we ask are very much based on a system. So visual questions isolate visual, the visual system isolate visual questions, the auditory system isolate auditory questions. But then if we get to multisensory, that's a combination. Say, for instance, you go to a shopping mall, or where do you sit and work? There's not one particular system that we then ask. So there's multiple senses that's involved in the multi-sensory dimension. So the questions there is really, how do we combine the senses? How do they work together? It's around energy level, multitasking. Are you busy with a lot of stuff, or do you want to prefer to work on just one task at the same time? So it's a combination of sensory systems together based on environments or type of habits. And then also bringing some of the senses together in that particular way. But it is based on habits, environments, and how do people approach certain tasks. And then the total score is just a total of all the systems together with the multisensory to give you that equal score. Okay. So hopefully that helped. Tanya, are you still okay with the talk? Can I move on to the next? I'm going to just share a brief case study with you, and it is not a case that I personally work with. I was involved in a training sessions for Canada, and I was looking for people on the neurodiversity spectrum just to check in with. So when I worked with Jane, not her real name, she was being seen by one of our practitioners, but she agreed to spend just a session with me to explain what did she learn from the matrix and how has it influenced her life. And then what I actually did, and this is a bit of an idea for you, after I've worked with her during just 1 hour session to go back to what did she learn from the sensory matrix process, I asked her to write her own case study. Because I'm so adamant about case studies and sometimes it's hard to write it. So this is just a consolidation, 2 slides of what she wrote up herself. Okay. So without going into detail, what was happening, she was a lecturer and a PhD candidate for an engineering school, but diagnosed with Asperger's as well as ADHD. And she was really drowning. She was chronically fatigued. She was struggling with basic daily tasks, and she just couldn't get good progress and forward with her PhD. Not because she lacked the ability, but because, she was just struggling with so much going on. She was constantly overloaded and feeling overwhelmed. And, so what we really did is just mapped out her sensory world for her. She had low energy, low self-esteem, and low output. And also her executive functioning was at an all-time low. She had a very hypersensitive nervous system. I didn't show her systems here or scores here, but it was also very much low thresholds. Not people only with low thresholds have neurodiversity. You can also find a pattern into high thresholds as well. Low thresholds are more common in the neurodiversity group, but you can also find high threshold or extreme high thresholds. Tanya, I just want to take the poll off from my screen. It's okay, great stuff. So the sensory matrix changed that. So what we did, yes, she was sensory avoidant, critically low auditory threshold, very, very low. I think she was a -10. And for instance, one of the targeted interventions that we did was noise cancelling headphones, which made a huge difference for her. There were a lot of others as well. But then I actually asked her, can she map out what has changed for her and how was it before she went through this process and what was it afterwards? And there was obviously a lot more detail, but her personal self-care was 30% efficiency and it moved up to 70%. So the light blue was before the intervention and the dark blue was after intervention. And I asked her to score it herself. Her executive function, 20% moved up to 50%. Social capacity, 40% to 75%. That's a nice one because social capacity is always such a thing that they struggle with because of that having such a huge impact on that. Emotional regulation from 40% to 70%, and then professional productivity from 50 to 80%. which I think is really nice. I always like if clients can really see these changes and we can track it or could according to real numbers. She completed her PhD. She entered the workforce with a lot more confidence, and the clarity really replaced the guesswork. So there's obviously a lot more detail with this case, but I just really like the fact that she could actually label and quantify the changes that she've experienced through learning about her own sensory system and how did she apply that with the help of the practitioner that were working with her so that she could gain the necessary benefit and insight. All right, so those are our 3 case studies. So before we go into questions, I just want to ask you a few questions. If you want to know, how do I learn this? How do I apply this properly? Or how do I integrate this into my current work? And for us, it's also, how can I grow my revenue and my income using the Sensory Matrix and Sensory Intelligence ecosystem? Because we are really providing a platform for learning and going through our training so that you can actually empower yourself as a clinician or as a practitioner and to actually expand the work that you are doing and obviously create a different revenue stream for you. I did see somewhere it was popping up. Do we only train OTs? No. Our course is not exclusive. It's open to anyone who's got a professional background and who does work in the people field, whether you're a coach or a psychologist or maybe you're a social worker or a counselor. So we definitely would go through your credentials, but it's open for anyone who's interested in the people development space. So if you wanted to attend and look into our practitioner's course, we've got a practitioner's course and then licensing opportunities in that process. Our next course starts the 1st of August till the 31st of October. So over those 3 months, it's quite an intensive learning opportunity where we take you a deep dive into all of the theory, the research, assessments, applications, and it's a blended process between hybrid, live Zoom sessions, as well as a lot of self-directed, self-paced sessions through our learning management system. So we share neuroscience, really deep neuroscience tools and case applications. It is accredited for CPD. I think you get 30 CPD points through the University of Stellenbosch, and then I think there's 20 and 16 ICF accredited points, but it is designed for professionals to expand on your toolbox and providing you a revenue, a reputational tool, and you really become part of our learning and our impact community. That's the big thing for me that I'm very proud of and that I always try to do is how do we create a community of people who do this work and who we can support each other and grow together. Also, we do have more webinars coming up. Today was around neurodiversity. Our next webinar would be around wellness coaching because there's a lot of our practitioners who work in the therapy space, but then there's also a lot of our practitioners who work more around health promotion and wellness. So that will be the 30th of June. 11th of August, my personal favorite, talking about relationship and workplace teams. And then also the one in October around sensory inclusive design. That's another big field where we are now looking in how do architects, space designers, workplace designers consider the senses in design, not just being sensory informed, but also being sensory inclusive. Okay, so are there any questions? We've got some time for questions. Tanya?
Yes, Anna Marie, I'm just going to relaunch the poll. Some people missed it, so I'm just going to relaunch that now.
Okay, cool. Why you are just completing the poll is just so that we know to give you your CPD points afterwards. Because although Zoom give us all of these wonderful reports, but matching up the Zoom report with versus what we can see on the screen is not always so clear, and with our registration form. Okay, great stuff. Is there anyone? Yeah, go for questions.
There's a question. Could you please give examples of general restorative tasks that someone with a low threshold for sound and movement can benefit from? She knows that it depends on the client, but just some examples.
Oh, yeah, obviously. That's a good question. So if it's someone who's sensory sensitive and avoiding and have got low thresholds and it's around sound and movement, we would obviously go into a lot of quiet spaces. Do people have quiet spaces? Do they have containment where they can go into? So for instance, Look, for headsets or noise cancelling headsets or earphones are always a great tool, but we always have to combine that with what type of activities do people need to do? We call them sensory diets, or what type of environmental changes can people make sensory ergonomics? So for those people, have you got a quiet space at work? Have you got a quiet space at home? Are you going into those activities? It could be walking, it could be yoga, it could be rowing. So I would always look at also restorative. Is it something that they can do from a physical point of view? Because we know movement are often self-regulatory, but it could also be crafts or people going into their own space and doing art. Or painting or doing any kind of needlework or knitting. It's really about activity. So think activity and think environment. What should you be doing to recharge or rest or restore your system, which is often go quiet, go less, and what type of environment should you be going into? So, there's also a lot of avoidance patterns. So hopefully that has helped. Obviously, it does differ from client to client. It can also be sitting somewhere and building puzzles. I kind of steer away from any kind of technology use because, we then struggle with digital fatigue. So even though maybe, yes, you can watch a movie, but doom scrolling on social media is nothing that I never suggest that because I think in itself is not always a restorative activity at all. Tanya, more questions. Hopefully that has helped.
Yeah, and follow up is the low threshold always avoidant?
Not necessarily, not necessarily. Low thresholds can just be passive in their response. So they could just be more aware of what goes in their environment. So the low threshold is more passive. If they become more active and trying to go against the threshold, then they become avoidant. So also when we do our training, we do have two crude groups, high thresholds and low threshold, but within low thresholds and high thresholds, you've got more the passive response, which they're not necessarily avoiding, no. And then you've got the active response, which people are typically very much avoiding. Sometimes it's very clear to distinguish that between clients. Sometimes it's messy and it's a bit of a mix between the two. But no, low threshold doesn't necessarily mean sensory avoidance. It often does, but not always. No, definitely not. Good question.
Okay, there's also a logistics question. Are the people in this webinar, will they be able to get the mental health webinar recording?
Sure, sure. If you reach out to support@sensoryintelligence.com, we will happily share that with you. Yes, anytime. You're really welcome to do that. We will share the recordings with you. Yeah, in our previous webinar, we spoke about depression and anxiety, and we had 3 of our practitioners who shared their particular case studies. And then the first one that we also had 3 other case studies of just people who went through our training or were exposed to our training and how it changed them personally, not client related, but self-related. You can even get access to that should you want to know. Tanya, more questions?
Okay, another question for Tasneem. Hoping she's still around.
Yeah, she's here.
Good. So might need to just unmute her. So Tasneem, you referred to completing an occupational profile as part of the assessment. Do you have a particular version of this that you use? The person who's asking the question only sees the AOTA one, the American OT Association occupational profile. Which one did you use? Or do you have your own version? I don't know where you are, so I can't.
Yeah, I see where you are, but I can't unmute, so you can unmute.
There you go. Okay, Tasneem, you there?
Tasneem, you can't unmute yourself because that's
I've
just
asked her to
restriction on the.
unmute. Yeah. I don't know if she's there though.
Yeah, she is here. She is
Oh,
here.
there we go.
There we
Okay,
go.
can you hear me
Go for it,
now?
Tasneem. Yes, we
Okay.
can. Go for it.
So it's my own version. I basically took the versions from the model of human occupation and then created my own. It's basically an Excel sheet, and what I do is I get them to complete what they do for every 30 minutes of a typical day. For a lot of my clients are freelancers, so they don't have a typical day. So I would say, okay, take at least 1 or 2 typical average days. Obviously, not every day is going to look the same. And they would list that. And then they answer a bunch of questions. So they'll ask, like, how do they categorize this? Is it a self-care activity? Is it leisure? Is it work? Whatever. And then they ask, why do they do it? Because I have to, I need to, there's nothing else to do. How satisfied? They ask like a bunch of questions, and it's quite revealing for them to, like, for some people, it can be quite triggering because they realize how little they do or how much time they spend doom scrolling, etc. And it's quite nice to then look at that versus, okay, what is the sensory environment that they're doing these things in? And like maybe they say they're unsatisfied, or maybe they say that they hate this activity, etc. So it's how I combine the time, how they use their time, and where they can fit. Because people always say, "Oh, I don't have time to do the restorative activities," but actually, when we do this activity, we're like, "There's time if you shift things around," or yeah.
Thank you, Tasneem.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Tasneem. Any other questions, Tanya?
Yes, there's still some more.
Okay.
Can a person have sensory issues but not be on the autistic spectrum?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, I don't like to call them sensory issues, by the way. In my world, they're not sensory issues. They are just that's your sensory identity. That's why we actually chose the name to go with sensory identity. So it only became sensory issues when the problems that you have is intense, frequent, and impacting your function, which we often do see in neurodiversity or mental health diagnosis. But you can have sensory preferences without being autistic. Absolutely. For instance, I've got a low vestibular threshold. I get seasick and I'm not the best driver. I don't like to do road trips because I get quirky and I get irritable and I don't like that. So all of us, and this is, we go through our training, we start with your own sensory matrix and we go through your own sensory thresholds, because if you understand it, there's no right or wrong. We all are differently wired. We respond to sensory stimulation differently. But we do say that there's an intense response typically that is associated with these diagnostic groups. If we talk about the neurodiversity group, yes, they've got more intensified sensory responses and it impacts their life more. But yes, we can certainly have sensory issues without being autistic. All of us have a sensory identity and a sensory style. Good question. Tanya,
Mm.
more questions.
Okay.
I think we've got
Here's
time for
more.
one more. Let's see how it goes.
One
Yes.
more. Okay. So, how would you approach intervention with an ASD client that has fluctuating scores in 3 or more of the sensory systems?
Yeah, fluctuations are quite common. It's very common in this particular group as well. And then it's a matter of you really have to work hard with the client for them to understand when they need to identify when are they fluctuating, how are they fluctuating, and for what are they fluctuating, because fluctuations can often be contextual. I'm high threshold at home, or I'm low threshold at work. I'm just using it as an example. Or it can be for particular different sensory stimulation. For instance, if we look at the visual system, we've got color, we've got light, we've got clutter. So each of these sensory systems have different dimensions that we are measuring. So you have to go and do a deep dive with your client to understand where does the fluctuations occur, what is the context, what is the type of stimulation, and when. And then the key thing is how do we control for that? So then the key thing is, I always say, if you've got low threshold, you reduce stimulation. If you've got high threshold, you increase stimulation. If you've got fluctuations, then you need to know how to control for it. Because sometimes more can be implemented, but sometimes less could be implemented. So we need to understand what is the specifics about those fluctuations for the client, and then we use the same principles around that. It is harder. It is harder to manage fluctuations because you can see it literally shift from one moment to the next. And then for me, it's always, how do we prevent people from going into overload? Also, can they identify what are the trigger points? And then can we prevent those trigger points? So for me in my world, prevention is always better than cure. So being a lot more, we do a whole thing around anticipation, planning, and preparation. Anticipate and then plan and prepare for it before the overload occurs and it actually triggers a negative sensory response. But it is a more complex part to work with, yes. Tanya? Oh no, we don't have more.
One
Was
more
there one
time.
final one?
Okay, one final one. We had, can you explain, if you know, the sensory origin of vocal stimming? Quite a nice one.
Oh, why did I ask for another question? I've sort of said we're done. Look, I think stimming in the ASD population is really, really interesting. I've worked with it a lot in clinical space. And without going into too much detail with it, it's often self-calming and self-regulatory patterns. And the origin is often around overwhelm and overload, but it can also be different to that. But stimming seems to correlate with self-regulation or the urge for self-regulation capacity. Thank you all for being here. It is on the dot 7 o'clock, so I'm leaving you with a quote. I love quotes. We must not only learn to tolerate our differences, we must welcome them, as well as the richness and diversity which can lead to true intelligence. I truly believe in this particular group of people. There's so much that we can offer. They've got exceptional skills that they can contribute to community, to work, to family. So I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you all for sharing, Tanya, Helen, and Tasneem. Thank you all for attending. Keep up the good work. If there's anything that you need, we are only a phone call or an email or a social media message away. So we hope to see you again in the future. Thanks, guys. Take care and be good.